From Thom Hartmann's Daily Take Substack. Are billionaire bribes, ideology, or fear driving the Supreme Court's obedience to Trump? Whether bought, brainwashed, or bullied, the 6 conservative justices have abandoned their oath, and the consequences are tearing our republic apart. Published September 23, 2025. The following is a song inspired by this article.
I put a spell on you, 6 robed in the night. You hear no arguments, but still you're ruling my sight. 'Cause you're mine, every shadow ruling, every whispered line. The Constitution cries, but you don't decline. 'Cause you're mine. Precedent's broken, like glass on the floor. I whisper my anger, and you open the door. 'Cause you're mine. You feel my followers waiting outside. You fear the fury you can't survive. So you're mine. Cause you're mine, the gavel falls, but the law is blind. The shadows speak and you don't decline. Yeah, you're mine.
Are they afraid Trump will get them killed? 90 years ago, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt fired William H. Humphrey from the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. Humphrey sued to the Supreme Court, which ruled that the Constitution had never given, quote, illimitable power of removal, unquote, to the president, and that he couldn't fire Humphrey. The case is called Humphrey's Executor versus United States, and Humphrey got his job back. The unanimous decision of the court was clear and explicit, quote, we think it plain under the Constitution that illimitable power of removal is not possessed by the President in respect of officers of the character of those just named. The authority of Congress in creating quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial agencies to require them to act in discharge of their duties independently of executive control cannot well be doubted, and that authority includes, as an appropriate incident, power to fix the period during which they shall continue in office, and to forbid their removal except for cause in the meantime. For it is quite evident that one who holds his office only during the pleasure of another cannot be depended upon to maintain an attitude of independence against the latter's will, end quote. Yesterday, without public argument, debate, or discussion, the Republican majority on today's court let Trump fire FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, a complete and obvious deviation from the Humphreys precedent. They gave no reasoning other than that they'll deal with the issue later. Justice Elena Kagan was having none of it, issuing a blistering dissent that said, in part, quote, Our emergency docket should never be used, as it has been this year, to permit what our own precedent bars. Still more, it should not be used, as it has been, to transfer government authority from Congress to the President and thus to reshape the nation's separation of powers." End quote. Why are these 6 Republican appointees deferring to Trump in such an obvious violation of precedent and the Constitution they've sworn to uphold? This, and a handful of other times they've rolled over for Trump, is quite literally unprecedented. The 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court have been amazing, baffling, and horrifying court watchers and judges beneath them from across the political spectrum as they use their so-called shadow docket to issue dictates that clearly contradict the Constitution, violate settled precedent, and even break black-letter law. All, apparently, to appease Donald Trump. As the famous conservative judge Michael Ludick recently wrote, quote, "He has enthralled our Supreme Court, spellbinding it into submission to him and his will rather than to the Constitution in its will, and our Supreme Court has favored him with its affirmation and its acquiescence in his lawlessness." End quote. But why are these 6 justices going along with this? Is it because, like is alleged by Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito, that they're all on the take, benefiting from the largesse of right-wing billionaires or Leonard Leo, who are ordering them to violate the very oath they took when they assumed office? Or is it because they're so ideologically extreme, wed to a 21st century form of neo-fascism, that they're enthusiastic to overturn 249 years of our constitutional order? Or could it be that they're simply terrified to cross the Don, a man who told the world this weekend that he, quote, hates, end quote, people who cross him? Look at what he's doing right now to his former Republican colleagues and employees, James Clapper, James Comey, and John Brennan. And don't forget Miles Taylor. It's brutal. Consider also what they've done so far this year, handing down more shadow docket rulings in 9 months than during the entire 16 years of the Bush and Obama administrations combined. In U.S. versus Schilling, they let Trump dismiss transgender individuals from the armed forces, even though the ban clearly constituted invidious discrimination that violates the Fifth Amendment's equal protection component and due process. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. In OPM versus AFGE, they blew up civil service protections for civil workers, creating a due process debacle to let Trump fire pretty much anybody he wanted. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. In Department of Education versus California, they allowed Trump to engage in illegal viewpoint-based retaliation against DEI-related content and violate the First Amendment and the spending clause limits. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson were so furious that they wrote 2 dissents. In Nome versus National TPS Alliance, they trampled due process and undermined the law Congress had passed that allowed immigrants to have temporary protected status so Trump could pull that protection from any brown-skinned person he wanted, although this was specifically about Venezuelans. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. In Nome versus Svetlana Do, they allowed across-the-board termination of, quote, humanitarian parole, end quote, and work authorizations for hundreds of thousands of people here legally from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, trashing the Constitution's requirement for individual process and to avoid disparate impact. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. Justices Sotomayor and Jackson were so angry they wrote a joint dissent. In Trump versus Casa de Maryland, they allowed Trump to start narrowing birthright citizenship in what the dissenters said, quote, directly contradicts the text and original meaning of the 14th Amendment, end quote. Civil rights groups called Trump's executive order, quote, flatly unconstitutional, but they heard no arguments and gave no explanation. In Nome versus Vasquez Perdomo, they allowed ICE to seize, search, and detain people based on their race, language, accent, or job description, in clear violation of both the civil rights law, the 14th Amendment, and the 4th Amendment protections of privacy and the requirement for a warrant to be judge-issued based on reasonable suspicion and witness testimony. They heard no arguments and gave no explanation. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson were so furious they wrote a dissent. In Trump versus Wilcox, they allowed Trump to defy the constitutional separation of powers framework and long-standing limits on at-will removal for certain independent agency officials to get rid of officials he didn't like in independent agencies that Congress had previously separated from the president's overview in clear defiance of the U.S. Constitution. Every one of these decisions is shocking on its face, and more like them are expected. Next month it is most likely a decision that may further gut voting rights in America, the only advanced democracy in the world where voting is still a privilege and can be withdrawn without notice instead of a right. Why is this happening? While the two elected branches get their legitimacy from, quote, the will of the people, end quote, the Supreme Court derives its legitimacy from openly and transparently deliberating after hearing arguments and explaining its rationale so anybody can understand its logic and the decisions can become a guide for future court cases. When the court simply says, quote, this is the way it is because I say so, end quote, like a parent talking to a child rather than explaining, it erodes faith and confidence in our justice system. It becomes a type of justice system, in fact, that Americans has never seen before outside the old Confederacy. That's the kind of damage these shadow docket decisions cause. So why would they do this? Why would these 6 people defy the founders and framers, spit on the Constitution, and trample the rule of law, all in the service of a single wannabe dictator? I've heard the arguments that they're on the take, and they're compelling, particularly when it comes to their Citizens United decision that allowed billionaires to buy politicians and judges, and came soon after a right-wing billionaire had showered Clarence Thomas and his wife with millions in gifts and vacations. And it's clear that at least Thomas and Alito are so ideologically extreme that they probably wouldn't have been uncomfortable on the German Supreme Court in the 1930s. But I think the real reason is that they're terrified. After all, these are not, like the 13 of the billionaires in Trump's cabinet, rich people. Sidewalk protests in front of Kavanaugh's and Roberts' homes have left the nation see that they live in nice houses and nice neighborhoods, but don't have the gated security and armed guards of your average decamillionaire or billionaire. They feel vulnerable, and for good reason. Roy Den Hollander posted pro-Trump writings online and had officially volunteered for Trump's 2016 presidential campaign prior to showing up at the door of federal judge Esther Salas, disguised as a FedEx driver. Her 20-year-old son, Daniel, answered the door, and Hollander shot him dead, then wounded his father before escaping and ultimately killing himself. The initial story that went viral was that he'd been dressed up as a pizza delivery person. So, in the years since this incident, according to the U.S. Marshals Service, over 100 judges who've handed down anti-Trump decisions have had pizzas delivered to their homes at weird hours by way of saying, quote, we know where you live and can kill you whenever we want, end quote. The pizzas are often delivered to be addressed to, quote, Daniel Andel, careful of the judge whose home is targeted, and sometimes even to the children of the judges receiving the pizzas. Daniel was the son of Judge Esther Salas, who was killed in the attack, targeting her entire family, and Salas described this ongoing right-wing terror campaign against her peers as, quote, psychological warfare, end quote. Trump has used terms like, quote, monsters, lunatics, crooked, and radical left to describe judges who rule against him. His rhetoric regularly portrays judges who rule against him as political enemies, further fueling attacks and harassment from his supporters. Judge John McConnell, for example, said he received over 400 threatening voicemails, including messages like, quote, tell that son of a bitch we're coming for him, and, quote, I wish someone would assassinate your ass, end quote, after ruling against Trump. On top of that, of the 31 politically motivated attacks and assassinations since 2018, only one was done by a, quote, leftist, end quote. All 30 others were committed by confirmed right-wingers, the majority openly Trump supporters. Given this history, it's easy to see why these Supreme Court judges may be afraid of earning Trump's ire by ruling against him. They know that with just a half dozen sentences in his low-rent social media site, Donald Trump could say things about any one of them that would incite a lone wolf to come to their homes to kill them. Just last week, responding to the Kirk killing, Amy Coney Barrett said, quote, political discourse has soured beyond control, end quote. After all, if university presidents, wealthy heads of major law firms, the heads of CBS and ABC, and billionaires from Zuckerberg to Bezos are so terrified of Trump they'll humiliate themselves, think Tim Cook or Mark Zuckerberg before him, why wouldn't Supreme Court justices be too? It also explains why they're using the shadow docket instead of normal merits docket. Shadow docket decisions are temporary and easily overturned after Trump leaves office, theoretically limiting the damage these rulings are causing to our republic. They might have even convinced themselves that they're doing the best thing by postponing a moment of conflict to reduce Trump's damage to America. After all, both J.D. Vance and Elon Musk have said that they're willing to ignore decisions of the Supreme Court. Once an administration has gotten away with that, pretty much any power the Supreme Court has completely vanishes. This is a horrible truth all 9 members are well aware of, one alluded to by both Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall. The court has no mechanism to enforce its rulings other than its credibility. The Trump administration last week asked Congress for an additional $58 million to provide security to federal judges, presumably including the Supreme Court. Ironically, if they begin to feel safe as a result, Trump may rue the day he provided them with that additional security.